Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be talking about presidential bromances and frenemies. Many of our presidents have actually have been strong friends, allies, and also served as mentors and proteges to one another. So I'm going to try and go through um, all the notable presidential friendships and mentors and proteges and allies and that I noticed in my study of American presidents. So I want to try and make this quick, so not going to dive into details. So starting with our first president, George Washington. George Washington, of course, our first president, he served as a mentor to, um, uh, a number of our subsequent presidents, particularly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, James Madison is more noteworthy because they also were related through marriage. So James Madison was his wife Dolly Madison had been, the widow, her late husband, her late husband's sister had been married to George Washington's nephew. So through that link, they had some kind of association. And of course, George Washington, who had no biological kids of his own, he and being a soldier, a career soldier, a general, he served as a mentor to a number of people in his cabinet, famously Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, was not a president, but the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, our second president, John Adams, uh, and our third president, Thomas Jefferson, had a frenemy relationship uh, you know, that's historic and legendary. So, of course, both of them had been friends in France, and of course, during the convention that drafted, towards the Declaration of Independence, they had both been members of the Committee of Five, and Thom- Thomas Jefferson had been selected by John Adams to author the Declaration of Independence, and of course, uh, uh, John Adams, famously said he did so because Thomas Jefferson wrote 10 times better than him. And John Adams was a good author as well. He wrote as well. That was something our founding fathers did. They wrote extensively back then. So, and he also said he had a felicity of expression. And so they did share correspondence for a long time, for a long period. And also they continued their friendship in France. And Thomas Jefferson was actually quite close to John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams. So they also shared correspondence. In fact, Abigail Adams had sort of had custody of Thomas Jefferson's younger daughter when she was traveling to join him. He was in France and she was traveling. Interestingly, she was traveling with Sally Hemings, and so they were going to join him while he was the minister to France. And Abigail Adams and her husband, they'd been living in London because John Adams was minister to the court of St. James, and so Abigail Adams had custody of Thomas Jefferson's daughter, while she was, transiting to join him in France. And of course, and also, they'd had that long tour together in England. Both of them uh, you know, had ridden in a carriage together, just touring England. And John Adams got a chance to go to Stratford up on Avon to to check out the Bard's hometown. That's William Shakespeare's hometown. And while Thomas Jefferson toured the famous English gardens, so they did fall out after they became rivals for the presidency, and John Adams was our second president, and Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, and so they fell out at that time, and they didn't talk for a long time because um, John Adams realized Thomas Jefferson was conniving, backstabbing, and John Adams was a forthright man. He could be sanctimonious. So they didn't talk for a long time. However, they had a mutual friend who was a founding father as well, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, and he'd been an abolitionist. That's Dr. Benjamin Rush, and he thought he was doing a patriotic service, and it was for posterity to reconcile them, at least to correspond with one another. And so, of course, Thomas Jefferson, in retirement, he was living in Monticello in Virginia, while um, John Adams was retired in Massachusetts. And then they started this long correspondence that's historic, and they wrote one another for a long time. And of course, they both lived long lives. Thomas Jefferson lived to be over 80, while John Adams, lived to be 90. Uh, and interestingly, they both died on the same day on our independence, our 50th anniversary on July the 4th, the 50th anniversary of our independence. They died July 4th, 1826. Uh, Thomas Jefferson had died, uh, you know, a few hours before John Adams, and they said the last words of John Adams when he died was, uh, "Jefferson lives." Unknown to him, Jefferson had died shortly before. Um, so apart from them, Thomas Jefferson was also, he was from Virginia. He was a mentor to two presidents, at least two presidents. That's James Madison, with whom he formed the Anti-Federalist, or the Anti-Administration, or the Democratic Republican Party. It had so many names. So they both founded the Democratic Republican Party. They were core allies throughout. Thomas Jefferson was a great writer. He was not a good orator. In fact, he talked very sheepishly. You could hardly hear him. And it's funny, he was a giant of a man. He was very skinny, but he was as tall as George Washington. Nobody ever talks about the height of Thomas Jefferson. Um, but somebody who was a great orator in Congress was James Madison. So they were great allies. Of course, they both had this prodigious intellect, and so they were. It's funny. Histometric scholars, they both pegged them as having the same IQ, 160. Thomas Jefferson was famously a polymath, and he had the largest library in the Americas, over 6,500 volumes. Of course, he sold his collection to the U.S. government, which became the foundation of the Library of Congress after the Library of Congress had been burned down in the war with the British in 1812, which is called the Second War of Independence. Um, so Thomas Jefferson mentored James Madison, and they collaborated together on a number of writings. It was Thomas Jefferson that sort of persuaded James Madison to write the Bill of Rights, and of course they had precedents. They both collaborated on what was notorious, infamously, the the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, um, which set the bad precedent for subsequent secession. That was when they were challenging John Adams's infamous Alien and Seditions Act of 1798, And so, it was sort of where he was being draconian and trying to limit free speech and saying, citizens could be imprisoned for criticizing the government or the president. And so they drafted those Kentucky resolutions and the Virginia, uh, you know. So they both collaborated a lot, and again, James Madison was protege to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, was older than James Madison. Another person that Thomas Jefferson mentored was President James Monroe. James Monroe, of course, was our fifth president, and Thomas Jefferson encouraged James Monroe to become friends with James Madison, and so they became friends as well. James Madison and uh, James Monroe both became friends. James Monroe served as James, sorry, um, yes, James Monroe served as James Madison's Secretary of State, and of course, so uh, James James Monroe also served uh, read law under Thomas Jefferson. Back then, they didn't have a law school. Law was a practical profession in which a candidate for to be a lawyer went to apprentice at a law firm. Typically, they pay a fee, and so they apprentice as a clerk, and over some years, and they eventually take the bar. So James Monroe read law in under Thomas Jefferson in Thomas Jefferson's law firm, law office. That's what they called it back then. And so, and again, as I mentioned, James Monroe and James Madison became friends through the encouragement of Thomas Jefferson. Uh, now we're at John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, our president, who Geometrics pegs as having the highest IQ of all our presidents at 175, which is significantly higher than any other American president. The next top IQ to James John Quincy Adams at 175 is 160. That's which both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson have. So you can see the significant difference. So um, John Quincy Adams, which is kind of bizarre, paradoxically, even though he was a diplomat. In fact, they say he was arguably America's best Secretary of State. Uh, so you expect a diplomat is somebody who gets along with everybody, but he was paradoxically very aloof, which is understandable because of his intelligence. He didn't have a successful presidency. He had one term, and but he hardly got anything achieved. But it's interesting that his goals, his vision, his plans. Although he didn't achieve anything during his time as presidency, about century later, these things were executed by the U.S. government. For instance, he wanted a national observatory. Of course, this came to fruition with the Smithsonian. He wanted national universities, institutions of learning. He wanted, there are many things that he wanted done. He wanted um, infrastructure, roads that would link, different places. I think it was him that built the Erie Canal. At least he was successful with that. But some president that he got along with uh, was prior to that's James Buchanan. So he and sorry, not James Buchanan, Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore and John C. Quincy Adams were friends. If John Quincy Adams, who was famously aloof, if he could be said to have any friends, they did exchange books and they visited one another. Of course, Millard Fillmore was from New York, John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts. So they visited one another when they were in each other's states, which was reasonable. And so and they collaborated together. They both worked together in Congress. But John Quincy Adams, I think he died before Millard Fillmore became president. Now, Millard Fillmore, interestingly, I think I've mentioned it before. He's one of those few presidents who was actually born poor. So most of our presidents were wealthy or um, solidly middle, upper middle class. Very few of them were actually born poor, like Lincoln, very impoverished Lincoln, or and Millard Fillmore, or Andrew Johnson, even Andrew Jackson. So those are the few, but most of them were actually very came from very solidly middle class, upper middle class, even very wealthy homes, right? So Millard Fillmore, of course, would go on to marry. He worked hard. He worked hard and taught himself to read, and became a lawyer. And fortunately for him, after his presidency, he married a very wealthy woman, and he lived in a mansion for the rest of his days. He married a wealthy woman, Catherine McIntosh, who was the daughter of a bank president, and she was a widow of another very wealthy man. So he uh, got to live the rest of his life in wealth and luxury and splendor. Uh, Now, another president, now Andrew Jackson mentored uh, James Polk. James Polk's 11th president. So he was mentored to James Polk. James Polk was also mentored by Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren. Um, Now, after him, there's I'm going to do a little digression from the pattern, because it's I've been talking about the friendships of presidents. So I'm going to talk about the friendship of a president and a vice president. Uh, so James Buchanan, who was our 15th president, is routinely ranked the worst president we've ever had. So James Buchanan, who is our only president who never married, was a bachelor, lifelong bachelor, but he had a famous bromance with our vice president, who was Franklin Pierce's vice president, William Rufus King. And both of them had shared a home together, lived together for many years in Washington. That's William Rufus King. He also never married. Um, Andrew Jackson uh, disparagingly called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, right? So that was a derogatory uh, term for an effeminate or a homosexual person then. So they used to have rumors then. They used to call uh, the vice president, William Rufus King, um, uh, Buchanan's better half. That's President Buchanan's better half. So those two, they had a very long term relationship, and that Washington D.C. circles always speculated on, and so they had rumors going around. So now that's those two. Now also there was President Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant mentored President Rutherford B. Hayes. Ulysses Grant, of course, was our 18th president, and he was the commanding general who preserved the Union, won the Civil War for the Union, and preserved the defeated the Confederacy. Uh, Now, Rutherford B. Hayes had also been a general. I think he'd been a brevet major general the in the Union Army, and he'd served under, uh, Grant when he was a general, and he really admired Grant, and Ulysses Grant mentored him. Now their relationship would fray later on, much later on, over policy, but they granted Ulysses Grant uh, had mentored Rutherford B. Hayes. Um, so and Rutherford B. Hayes in turn mentored President William McKinley, our 25th president, who got assassinated by an anarchist. So President William McKinley was mentored. They were lifelong friends. They wrote, letters to one another, and they'd served together in the same regiment, in Ohio regiment, and so. McKinley admired Rutherford B. Hayes a lot, and Rutherford B. Hayes helped McKinley's career. In fact, he helped him uh, his political career. Um, Now, Chester A. Arthur, 21st president, I'm also going to do another deviation, not with the president. So he had been, he was someone who had never sought elective office for himself. And he was just part of the spoil system. And he was a main cog in the uh, Republican political party machine of a guy called a party boss called Roscoe Conklin, who was about the most powerful man in America at that time. He wanted to be president. He didn't get to be president. He was offered Chief Justice of the United States. He'd been offered the position twice, and he was actually elected. The Senate confirmed him, but he refused it because he wanted to remain a senator because he controlled the spoil system as a party boss. I've done a video discussing the party boss. It was a very corrupt system in which the president, got to make federal appointments into the civil service, and there were very lucrative jobs like the collector of the Port of New York, which Chester A. Arthur held for many years, and it controlled a lot of jobs. And people who got these federal civil service jobs, they, as a rule, there was a rule then that they paid an assessment, which might come to about 7% of their salaries back to the party. So uh, it was a very corrupt money making system back then. And so Roscoe Conklin had been the mentor of Chester A. Arthur. And in fact, Chester A. Arthur had never sought elective office. Lived through his entire career was through the spoil system. He'd held many different lucrative jobs in New York that made more money than the office of President of the United States, just like the collector of the Port of New York. But Roscoe Conklin had been trying to get Ulysses Grant a third term, and so he'd sort of been blindsided. And so, as a nod to him, however, they decided to make his protege, be on the be a vice president on the ticket of James Garfield, who was a dark horse candidate. He wasn't seeking it either. But people didn't want Grant for a third term because Roscoe Conklin was trying to get a third term for Ulysses Grant. Unfortunately, that administration under President Grant, of course, this was shortly after the Civil War, and then they had the spoil system. It was noteworthy for having been very corrupt because of the patronage, the spoil system, and all the things that were, influence peddling. This was the 19th century, just after the Civil War, and so Chester A. Arthur had been a protege of Roscoe Conklin. Roscoe Conklin was a very impressive man, by the way. He was a drafter of the 14th Amendment, of course, which gave African Americans citizenship, defined, citizenship for birthright citizenship and naturalized citizens, and as well as providing equal protection of the law and due process of the law as an application towards, all the states as well. So, so after James Garfield was assassinated and Chester A. Arthur became president, uh, Chester A. Arthur was hit with this sense of contrition, right? And he decided to reform the civil service and end the spoil system. And of course, Roscoe Conklin and Chester A. Arthur never spoke again. And Roscoe Conklin, as an act of protest, he retired. He resigned his position as senator and went back into the practice of law. Interesting, both men died, shortly after. Roscoe Conklin suddenly, unexpectedly, and of course Chester Arthur, who had been ill, he died, had a disease, and an illness, was a Bright's disease, and he died the year after he left the presidency. Um, so uh, I've I've mentioned McKinley having been a protege of President Rutherford B. Hayes, and Rutherford B. Hayes himself had been a protege of uh, President Ulysses Grant. Now, uh, two other presidents who were frenemies, had a bromance. Uh, Teddy Roosevelt, our 26th president, and his handpicked protege. In fact, Roosevelt was the one who made Taft, William Howard Taft, who was our heaviest president. He's the one who actually manipulated him. He maneuvered him into the presidency. And of course, they were very close. And Roosevelt was always giving him assignments and using him and, encouraging him. In fact, Roosevelt was the one who talked him into running for office because Roosevelt had promised not to seek another term. And so, he felt bound, obligated to keep his promise. So he talked, invited his best friend Taft to the White House and to a dinner, and he talked him into, just running for office. And of course, Roosevelt, who had an outsized influence, in the media, in the public, in the U.S. public, amongst in the polls and public opinion, was able to maneuver Taft, who liked to operate, in the background silently. Roosevelt was able to successfully maneuver him and to gain the presidency. However, after a while, Taft became an independent man, and Roosevelt decided he wanted to be president again. Taft wasn't going to back down. He also wanted a second term, and so this split the Republican Party when Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party, and I think it's the only time that an independent third party actually you know ran second. So he ran second, and uh, Taft, who ran on uh, the Republican Party president, since he was the incumbent president, he came third, and this led Woodrow Wilson to become president. Woodrow Wilson didn't have friends, other presidents as friends, because he also was a famously aloof person. Of course, he was president of Princeton prior to and he became governor of New Jersey, but he was president of Princeton, and he was very famously aloof himself. So he didn't have friends, and of course, he had suffered a series of strokes while he was in office, and so he wasn't able to become friends with other presidents after office. Now he's now FDR, frankly, D. Roosevelt actually mentored um, Lyndon Johnson when Lyndon Johnson had been a congressman, was in Congress anyway, and during the Second World War. So he sent him on various assignments to represent him. One of them being to the Pacific. So they were on an aircraft, and They were shot at, and somehow Lyndon Johnson came out of that situation with a Silver Star Medal, while the rest of the people have considered it dubious, considering that the other um, crew members did not receive a medal. He was not actually in action; he was just aboard an aircraft. Now they said it was through the machinations of General MacArthur, who liked to pander to the politicians, to congressmen, of course, and that was how LBJ was able to get the Silver Star Medal. So Roosevelt had mentored uh, Lyndon B. Johnson. Um, Now, interesting talk about rivalry. I read um, Richard Nixon's memoirs, and it's kind of funny. Richard Nixon, in his memoirs, he sort of was always measuring himself against John Kennedy because both of them had been in the Navy. Both of them had then gone served in Congress at the same time. I think they were members of the same cohort, and then they went on to the Senate. So uh, in his memoirs, Nixon is sort of measuring himself against Kennedy and um, constantly, appraising his progress. And of course, maybe it's understandable because he was his rival in the 1960 elections when he narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy. But interestingly, of course, Nixon had also been the vice president of President Eisenhower. And it's funny that in Nixon's memoirs, he made it out to seem like he and Eisenhower were very close, and Eisenhower was like always a mentor to him. When you read Eisenhower's biography, uh, you find out Eisenhower didn't actually like Nixon, which is kind of ironic because Nixon ended up becoming in laws to Eisenhower. So Nixon's daughter married General President Eisenhower's grandson, David Eisenhower. So they became in laws. Um, so, it's something Eisenhower noted in his diary, right? He said he talked about Nixon, that he didn't know how someone could survive in politics without any close friends, just sort of alluding to the solitary nature of Richard Nixon, who was very infamously, journalists called him antiseptic and, very aloof. And something else Eisenhower said of Nixon, right? He said he never that he because Eisenhower was a very likable person. He was in the military. I guess military. There are lots of military people like that. Eisenhower was very liked, and he liked friends. He liked socializing. And Eisenhower noted that Nixon had no hobbies. He had no friends. He had nothing that he did. Everything he lived, ate, everything breathed politics. Everything was politics to him, and he had no hobbies. And everything was just politics. And Eisenhower made that observation about Richard Nixon. Um, so, so when we go into the 80s, we don't find the sort of early friendships that American presidents had in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So we don't see that in the 21st century. Um, that's about it for presidential friendships and mentorships. Um, I guess things have sort of changed. It's more the position is now less the ascent, the move to the position is now more mechanical, less organic, and I guess less even relationship based. If you notice something that's happening, somebody made an observation that since President Reagan, apart from President Joe Biden, every other president has had an Ivy League credential, and the Ivy League credentials were remarkably rare back then. Yes, many of our presidents came from especially the first president, the founding fathers. Of course, that was due to slavery and their interests as large agrarians, landowners. Our early presidents were wealthy. George Washington, you know, but of course, interestingly, up to some time in the 19th century, because the presidents didn't have a pension, the presidency left virtually every one of them poor. James Monroe was poor, died in New York. Interestingly, he also died on July 4th, and hardly a mention. Nobody noticed when he died. He also died on 4th of July. That's President James Monroe, who was our fifth president. I'd mentioned that he was mentored by Thomas Jefferson, and he read law under Thomas Jefferson, and of course he had the close relationship, friendship with James Madison. All these men were from Virginia, um, and but interestingly, I saw a documentary, and they did a documentary about Ulysses Grant, and they were talking about how he came from poverty, always failed, and then he won. He's like the American dream. America likes to. There are people who want to romanticize this hard scrabble. Uh, you know, pull yourself up from the bottom up, and it minimizes the spirit of cooperation. It creates this false narrative of the solitary individual that doesn't need society's help, who's alienated and just makes it. Yes, these quixotic ideals. It's okay to have them, but they shouldn't they shouldn't misrepresent reality. Ulysses Grant, didn't come from poverty. Ulysses Grant's father was a self-made man. Ulysses Grant's father didn't have money, but he became a wealthy man. He was a self-made man. I don't know his story, but I know he became a wealthy tanner. Right, he owned several tanneries in Illinois, in Ohio. He owned several tanneries and stores, selling leather goods, and he became a very wealthy man, and that was how he was able to fund Ulysses Grant's education at West Point, which was elite. In fact, he had connections. Ulysses Grant got in through a connection that the father had with, I think a senator in Ohio, because a senator could write a letter, could make a recommendation, write a letter, and select uh, somebody from their constituency, and that was what happened. So he was selected through a contact of the Ulysses Grant's wealthy father. In fact, I read the personal memoirs of Ulysses Grant while wrongfully detained, excellently written, and he did acknowledge that, yeah, he came from a solidly upper middle class family. He had comfort. His father bought him a horse when he was a kid, so he was actually an expert horseman. That was something they knew him for. And he wasn't a farm boy, right? So Ulysses Grant, didn't come from poverty. He hated his father's business. Yes, he'd done a variety of businesses and failed. He tried to be a farmer. He tried to go into business. He did many things, and he hated the tannery business. He didn't like his father's business. He hated the smell of the leather and things like that. So he said he wasn't going to go into it. I think when his father died, he had to run it for a while. But Ulysses Grant came from a wealthy. He had a wealthy father, and so um, so yeah. But I guess the most famous bromance is that of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And you can see it almost seems like John Adams liked Thomas Jefferson more than Thomas Jefferson cared for him. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, I guess, was a very busy man. They were both busy men. John Adams loved the classics. He loved reading, and of course, he wrote. But Thomas Jefferson was a polymath, unlike John Adams. Thomas Jefferson had an interest in about everything: science, architecture, literature, writing. So they loved books. They loved to discuss books together, and and so it's kind of interesting. If I remember any other presidents um, who had a bromance, but this is about as much. Every other president, from the 21st century, it's a fake relationship, right? It's a very political relationship that has an end to it. It's just a means to an end, not the sort of deep, organic. Um, is it Gemeinschaft relationships? There's a term Gemeinschaft, which is an organic relationship, and Gesellschaft, the German terms. One is organic, one's just mechanical. Um, I can't remember which one's which. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts perpetrated by rogue government officials in Montgomery County, Maryland, and the state attorney's office, and a corrupt judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, Judge James Bonifant. He violated my constitutional rights after Montgomery County police officers swatted me and filed false charges against me in order to obstruct justice and prevent an Office of Special Counsel complaint I filed in the Department of Defense regarding fraud, waste and mismanagement, and of course with various Inspector General's offices as well, and an EEOC complaint for discrimination and harassment and sexual harassment, which I had filed. In any event, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.